The morning the ducks arrived was a Tuesday in late March, the kind of day that can't decide if it's the end of winter or the beginning of a false spring. It was 2007. I remember the air had that cold, wet smell of thawing ground, and the sky was the color of old tin from fence to fence. A low fog was settled in the bottoms, which my father always said was a good sign, meant the soil was breathing out the cold. I was standing by the mailbox when the trailer came rattling up the county road, a low-slung, rusty affair pulled by a truck that had seen better decades. The man driving it didn't get out, just rolled down his window. He had a tired look I recognized. The look of a man getting rid of a problem he'd lived with too long. Inside the wire cage on the trailer were the ducks. 80 of them, near as he could count. They weren't your picturesque white farm ducks. They were Muscovies, mostly black with iridescent green and purple feathers that didn't show unless the light hit them just right. The rest of the time they just looked dusty. Their faces were what got people. Bare, red, carunculed skin around their eyes and beaks, which on the males grew into a bumpy, strange mask. They looked prehistoric, and more than a few of them had bald patches on their heads and necks from a season of rough living. They were silent, which was the other unsettling thing. They just watched us, swiveling their heads. They looked less like birds and more like a committee of grim little judges. "You sure you want all of them?" the man asked, his engine idling rough. "Fella over in the next county said you were looking to take on some grazers." He used the word carefully, like he was trying it on for size and it didn't quite fit. I told him I was. "No charge," he said, almost before I could answer. "My wife wants a garden where their pen is. Says they look like vultures. Just take 'em." He backed the trailer up to the gate of the West 40. A piece of ground that hadn't been anything but a headache for my entire life. We got the ramp down and he shooed them out. They didn't scatter. They moved in a single, dark, shuffling mass, then stopped and stood there, looking at the expanse of standing water and cattails. My wife, Sarah, came out on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She stood there with her arms crossed, not saying a word. That's her way. She doesn't waste breath on a thing until she knows how many acres it involves and what it's likely to cost. 80 bald ducks, she said later that evening, looking out the window at the dark shapes huddled near the fence line. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, an inventory of the peculiar new reality on her farm. The next morning, my neighbor, Frank Miller, pulled his truck up to the fence. His truck was always clean. A new 3/4 ton that never had so much as a speck of mud on the fenders. He farmed from the cab mostly with a GPS and a phone. He's not a bad man, just a certain one. He believes in what the numbers on a screen tell him. He idled there for a minute, watching the ducks venture out onto the soupy ground. They were moving in a slow, deliberate line, poking at the mud. "Morning," he called out. I was checking the fence charger and I walked over. "Those are some ugly birds, Tom," he said, not unkindly. It was just an observation. "What are you doing with 80 bald ducks on 40 acres of standing water?" I told him I was farming. He gave a short, barking laugh. "Farming what? Mosquitoes? That field's been a swamp since your dad's time. You can't even get a tractor on it past May." Most years, not at all. I just nodded. He was right. That 40 had been written off by everyone, including the county tax assessor, as unimprovable wetland. It was a shallow claypan bowl that caught all the runoff from the higher ground and never let it go. "Heard you got M for free," he added, which told me the story had already made it to the co-op. By noon, the diner would have a version of the story, and in that version, the ducks would probably be able to talk and I'd be wearing a tinfoil hat. I didn't say anything. I just watched the ducks. They were beginning to do what they do, dabbling in the shallow water, heads down, tails up, churning the mud with their bills. They were already finding something to eat. They were paying attention. My father had a saying for most things. One of his favorites was, "The land doesn't care who believes in it, it just is what it is, and it's up to you to see it for what it is." I didn't know yet what the ducks knew, but I had a suspicion they were about to teach me something my neighbor, with his clean truck and his perfect yield maps, had long since forgotten how to see. The mockery, when it came, was polite. That's how it is in a small community. Nobody calls you a fool to your face. They just ask you questions with the answer already baked in. A week after the ducks arrived, I went into town for a hydraulic fitting. The fellow behind the counter at the parts store, a good man I'd known for 30 years, leaned in conspiratorially. "Heard you're starting a bird sanctuary, Tom," he said with a grin. "Frank Miller was in here saying you got some real exotic-looking ones." I just told him they were Muscovies and I needed a 3/8 JIC fitting. He found the part, but the talk didn't stop. A few farmers were in there, waiting out a morning rain, and the conversation drifted over to me. "What's the plan with that West 40 anyway?" one of them asked. "You putting in a duck blind for hunting season?" It was a reasonable question, but his tone said he already knew the answer was no. I said, "Just trying something. That's a phrase that people around here understand. It means, I have a reason, but I don't want to explain it to you, and I'd appreciate it if you'd let me fail in peace." They respected it, mostly. The real test came a couple of weeks later. I called the university extension office. I did it partly as a courtesy to my wife, to show her I was doing my due diligence, and partly because I wanted to hear what the modern, credentialed expert would say. I wanted to have a baseline of official knowledge to measure against my own quiet hunch. The agent who came out was a young man named Kevin. He was sharp, well-intentioned, and wore a brand-new pair of Carhartt overalls that still had the factory creases in them. He carried a clipboard and a digital soil probe. He was impressed with my problem, if not my solution. He spent an hour walking the edge of the waterlogged field, taking readings. The ducks, by now, had established a routine. They spent their days in a long, meandering procession across the middle of the 40, never straying much from a particular path they seemed to have chosen. Kevin watched them for a moment, a bemused look on his face. "Interesting choice of livestock," he said, making a note on his clipboard. He walked back to me, his boots squelching in the mud. "Well, Tom, the data is pretty clear," he began, and I knew what was coming next. The credentialed certainty that ends a conversation. "Your soil profile here is about 70% heavy clay over a shallow hardpan. The percolation rate is practically zero. It's a classic perched water table. The water has nowhere to go." He showed me the numbers on his tablet. Columns of data about soil density and hydraulic conductivity. "Frankly, this land is best suited for a conservation easement. You could get a nice little annual payment for letting it be a wetland." I told him I wasn't interested in getting paid to do nothing. I was interested in farming it. He sighed, the patient sigh of a teacher explaining a difficult concept to a slow student. "Okay, if you're determined to drain it, there's only one real option. Systematic tiling. Given the lack of natural fall and the heavy soil, you'd need lines every 30 feet. On 40 acres, you're looking at, let's see." He tapped his calculator. "You're looking at close to 14,500 feet of tile. Installed, at today's prices, you're probably talking $4 a foot. Minimum." He let the number hang in the air.
$62,000.
For a piece of land that, even if it were perfectly drained and productive, might only be worth 70 or 80,000. The economics were an absolute non-starter, and we both knew it. "And even then," he added, "you'd have to get a permit to discharge that much water into the county ditch, and with the new watershed regulations, I don't think they'd grant it." He looked over at the ducks again, who were busy churning the mud in their self-appointed line. "I'll be honest with you," he said, lowering his voice a little. "Those birds aren't going to do anything. They might aerate the top inch of muck, but they're not going to change the hydrology of this field." He was polite. He was professional. He was quoting the book, and the book was clear. He thanked me for my time, handed me a brochure on wetland mitigation programs, and drove away. I stood there for a long time after he left, watching the ducks. They hadn't read the brochure. They didn't know about percolation rates or hardpan. They were just working. My father's voice came back to me then, clear as if he were standing next to me. "Most folks with a clipboard," he'd once told me, "are real good at telling you what something is. They're not always so good at seeing what it could be." The ducks were a $50 bet against a $60,000 certainty. I decided I'd let the bet ride. I want to be honest about my reasons. It wasn't just stubbornness, though there was some of that. It wasn't just that I'm cheap, though I'll own that too. My father taught me you can't farm what you've already spent, and $60,000 on that piece of ground was a fool's errand. The real reason I took in those 80 bald ducks went back 40 years, to a conversation I had with my dad when I was just a boy. He was a quiet man. He didn't talk to hear himself speak. When he said something, it was because he'd thought about it for a long time. We were standing at the edge of that same 40 acres, looking out at the water shimmering in the late afternoon sun. It had been a wet spring, and the field was a shallow lake, just like it was now. I was maybe 12 years old. I asked him why we didn't just sell it. Nobody would buy it, he said, not looking at me but at the field. And besides, it belongs here. It's part of the farm. Then he went quiet for a long time, chewing on a stem of timothy grass. I thought the conversation was over. But then he pointed with his chin toward the far side of the field, where the water ran up against a line of old willows that marked the county ditch. You see how the water just sits there? He said. It doesn't want to move. It's forgotten how to get to the creek. He paused again. But this ground wasn't always this wet. When my own father first broke this land, back in the 20s, this was good bottom ground. A little heavy, but it grew fine corn. I asked him what happened. People happened, he said. And time. Things get done and then they get forgotten. Trenches get dug and filled back in wrong. Old tiles get crushed and nobody knows where they are anymore. The land changes slow, and then one day you wake up and it's a swamp, and nobody remembers it being anything else. He kicked at a clump of dirt with the toe of his boot. But the water remembers, he said. And this was the part that stuck with me all those years. The water remembers the old ways. It's always looking for the path of least resistance, the way it used to go. If you could just give it a hint, just remind it of the old path, it would do the work for you. We stood there until the sun went down and he didn't say another word about it. But I never forgot it. The idea that the field wasn't broken, just forgetful. That the problem wasn't the water, but the path. For years, the memory was just a piece of sentiment. A story about my father. But when that man with the trailer of free ducks showed up, the story became a hypothesis. The ducks, with their endless, methodical digging and churning, weren't just eating. They were searching. Like the water, they were looking for the path of least resistance. Not for drainage, but for food. Grubs, snails, tubers, the things that live in the soft, silted places. I'd watched them for 3 weeks, and their pattern was undeniable. They weren't spread out across the 40 acres. They were concentrated in a wandering line, about 10 feet wide and nearly 1,000 feet long, running from the highest point of the flooded area right toward the lowest point near the willows. It was as if they were tracing something. My father's words came back. Trenches get dug and filled back in wrong. What if the ducks weren't just wandering? What if they were following the ghost of an old trench? A place where the soil was different, softer, filled with the organic matter they craved. What if they were giving the water the hint it needed? That was my real reason. It was a long shot, a theory built on a half-remembered conversation and the strange, silent work of 80 ugly birds. Sarah saw me watching them from the kitchen window night after night. She'd come and stand beside me. You think they're doing something, don't you? She asked one evening. I told her I did. You think they're fixing it? I told her I didn't know about fixing, but I thought they were remembering something. She was quiet for a minute. Then she said, Your father would have liked those birds. That was all the encouragement I needed. The next day, I decided it was time to stop guessing. It was time to find the notebook. I knew my grandfather had kept records. My father had told me stories about it. He wasn't a sentimental man, my grandfather. He was a man of figures and facts written down in a careful, spidery hand. He believed that memory was unreliable, but a number written on a page was a fact forever. He died before I was born, but his presence was still in the old barn, in the tools with his initials burned into the handles, in the way my father would sometimes stop and look at a field and say, Granddad would have planted oats here this year. I'd looked for his notebooks before, years ago, but never with a real purpose. I'd assumed they were lost to time and damp and mice. But now I had a purpose. I had a 40-acre question that needed a 60-year-old answer. I started in the house, in the old secretary desk where my grandmother kept important papers. Nothing but old tax returns and deeds. I spent the next 2 days going through the barn, top to bottom. I pulled open dusty drawers filled with rusty bolts and dried-out leather washers. I climbed into the hayloft and shifted bales that hadn't been moved since I was a teenager. Nothing. I was beginning to think I'd imagined the whole thing. On the third day, I was in the old workshop, a lean-to built off the side of the main barn. It was my grandfather's space, and my father had left it largely untouched, a museum of old tools and half-finished projects. In the corner, under a canvas tarp, was a stack of wooden crates. They were full of old operators' manuals for tractors and combines we no longer owned. A manual for a John Deere Model A, an Oliver 70, a Massey Harris combine. I was about to give up when my hand hit something hard and flat at the bottom of the last crate. I pulled it out. It was a marbled composition book, the old kind with a soft black spine. The corners were rounded and soft from 1,000 openings. The cover was stained with oil and something that looked like coffee. In the little white box on the front, in faded pencil, was one word, ground. I opened it. The pages were filled with my grandfather's handwriting. It was all there. Planting dates from the 1920s through the late 1940s.
Yields per acre.
Notes on rainfall, fertilizer prices, the cost of a new plowshare. It was the entire history of this farm, written in columns of numbers and terse, declarative sentences. I took it back to the house and sat down at the kitchen table. Sarah put a cup of coffee by my elbow but didn't say anything. She knew what I was looking for. I flipped through the pages, looking for any mention of the West 40. In the section for 1934, I found it. He called it the bottom 40. He'd planted corn there that year. The yield was good, 90 bushels to the acre, which was a phenomenal crop for that time. He had notes on the soil. Heavy but drains well to the creek drains well. The words seemed to jump off the page. I kept reading. For the next few years, the yields were consistent. Then, in the entry for the fall of 1938, I found something different. He had drawn a rough map of the 40 acres. It wasn't to scale, but it was clear. He'd marked the high ground, the low ground, and the line of willows by the creek. And running right through the middle, almost exactly where I'd been watching the ducks make their daily pilgrimage, was a dotted line. Next to the line, he'd written a series of notes. Dug for marl, summer 38. Hit blue clay at 8 feet. Good vein marl. A clay mixture rich in lime. In those days, before commercial fertilizer was cheap and common, farmers would dig marl out of the ground and spread it on their acidic upland fields to improve the soil pH. It was a common practice, but hard, dirty work. Below that note was another. Filled with scraper. Too wet. October rains came early. Never filled proper, and then, at the bottom of the page, one last line, circled several times in pencil. The lead pressed so hard it had dug into the paper. It wasn't a statement. It was a question. Water holding? Check depth. He never answered his own question. The next year, 1939, the notes for the bottom 40 were different. Planted late. Too wet in the spring, the yield was down by half. The year after that, he put it in pasture. After that, there were no more entries for that field. He'd given up on it. Never filled proper. The words echoed my father's. Trenches get dug and filled back in wrong. My grandfather had dug 1,000-foot-long, 8-foot-deep trench to mine marl. Then, in a hurry to beat the fall rains, he'd pushed the excavated soil, a mix of topsoil, heavy clay, and whatever else was in the way, back into the trench while it was wet. He had, in effect, created a massive subterranean sponge, a dam of soft, poorly compacted fill that was now blocking the natural, slow drainage of the entire 40-acre bowl. It had soaked up the water and held it, turning what was once good bottomland into a permanent swamp. And for 70 years, nobody knew why. The reason was right here in a 50-cent notebook at the bottom of a crate. I closed the book. The ducks weren't just finding food. They were mapping the mistake. The next morning, I was out before the sun was up, with a T-handle soil probe in my hand. It was time to answer my grandfather's question. The investigation began in the quiet of dawn. The fog was thick again, clinging to the water on the field, and the 80 ducks were dark, silent shapes in the gloom. I had the notebook in a plastic bag in my jacket pocket and a long half-inch steel probe in my hand. It was a simple tool, just a 5-foot rod with a pointed tip and a T-shaped handle at the top. You learn more from a tool like that than any digital sensor. You learn by feel. I started on the north side of the field, a good 100 yards away from the line the ducks were working. I set my feet, put my weight on the handle and pushed. The probe slid through the first 12 inches of black topsoil and muck. Then it stopped. Not a gradual tightening, but a hard, definite stop like hitting a sheet of iron. I put my whole body into it, rocking back and forth. The rod wouldn't budge another inch. I pulled it up. The tip was smeared with a slick, bluish-gray clay. Hardpan, just like the extension agent said. I moved 10 feet over and tried again. Same result. 12 inches of topsoil, then the hard stop. I spent the first hour creating a grid, probing every 20 paces in the areas where the ducks weren't. The result was always the same. A shallow layer of good soil, then the impenetrable wall of clay, a bathtub with no drain. This was the field everyone knew, the field the data described. The problem. Then I walked over to the line. The ducks were starting to stir now, beginning their slow, deliberate work. They moved as a group, heads down, bills paddling in the shallow water, turning the mud over. Their path wasn't straight. It meandered, curving gently across the field like a slow-moving river. It was, I now knew, the path of my grandfather's 70-year-old mistake. I chose a spot right in the middle of their trail. The ground here looked different. It was more churned up, looser. I planted the probe and leaned into it. The difference was immediate. It sank through the first foot of topsoil just as before. But then it kept going. There was no hard stop. Pushed down through a thick, resistant layer that felt like wet putty. It wasn't easy, but it was moving. 2 feet. 3 feet. The handle was at my waist. I pushed harder, my boots sinking into the mud. For feet. The handle was at my chest. The entire 4-foot length of the main rod was buried in the ground. I pulled it out and looked at the soil clinging to it. It wasn't the slick, blue-gray hardpan. It was a mottled mix of black topsoil, yellow clay, and dark, organic silt. It was fill. It was the backfill from the trench. My heart was hammering in my chest. I moved 20 paces down the duck's line and tried again. Same result. The probe sank to its full depth. I walked the entire 1,000-foot line, from the slight rise where the digging must have started, all the way to the low end near the willows. Every single spot I probed along the path the ducks had chosen was soft, deep fill. Every spot I probed just 10 feet to the side of their path hit the hardpan at a foot or two. The ducks had found it. Their instinct for soft ground and the grubs and tubers that lived there had led them, with an accuracy no GPS could match, straight to the subterranean scar that had been holding this field hostage for 3 generations. They were spending 10 hours a day, 80 of them, doing nothing but churning and paddling and loosening the top layer of this compacted fill. The extension agent said they would only affect the top inch. But that top inch was the seal. My father's other piece of wisdom came to mind. The difference between a problem and a lesson is only whether you were paying attention. The ducks were paying attention to the ground. I was paying attention to the ducks. They were hydro-excavating, but in slow motion. They were breaking the capillary action of that dense, silted plug, one mouthful of mud at a time. They were reintroducing oxygen and water channels into the compacted soil. They were giving the water the hint it needed. They were reminding it of the old way to the creek. I spent the rest of that spring and the whole summer just watching. I didn't do anything but make sure the ducks had a safe place to roost at night and keep their water trough full during the dry spell in August. I walked the line every week with the probe. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the work got easier. The probe sank with less resistance. The field itself didn't look much different. It was still wet. It was still ugly. Frank Miller would drive by and shake his head. But I knew something was happening under the surface. The water was starting to remember. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. This was a quiet conversation between me, my grandfather's ghost, and 80 ugly birds. It felt too fragile to be exposed to doubt. The proof wouldn't be in a soil probe. The proof would come with the fall rains. By late September, I knew I needed another opinion. Not for my own sake, but for the sake of the record. My grandfather had left a question. I felt a duty to leave an answer, and I wanted it to be a solid one. I needed an expert, but not the kind with a clipboard and a pre-printed brochure. I needed the other kind of expert. The one who has spent 50 years walking ground like this, the one whose knowledge is in his hands and his eyes, not on a tablet screen. I knew a man named George. He was in his late 70s, semi-retired. For most of his life, he'd run a small drainage company, mostly locating and repairing old clay tile lines, the kind our grandfathers put in with shovels and mules. He'd forgotten more about how water moves through soil than that young extension agent would ever know. He worked with a steel probe just like mine but longer, and an intuition that was uncanny. I called him. I didn't tell him what I thought I'd found. I just said I had a drainage issue on my West 40 and I'd pay him for an hour of his time to walk it with me. He showed up a few days later in a beat-up Ford Ranger with a toolbox rusted into the bed. He was a small, wiry man with hands like gnarled roots. He didn't say much, just got out of the truck and pulled a long, slender steel rod from a canvas sleeve. It was 8 feet long with a T-handle at the top. He walked to the edge of the field and stood there for a long time just looking. The ducks were out in their long, familiar line, dabbling in the remaining shallow pools. Muscovies, he said. It wasn't a question. Heard you had M. He watched them for another minute. They're keeping to a funny line there. I told him they'd been doing it all summer. He just grunted. We walked out onto the field. The ground was still damp but much firmer than it had been in the spring. I showed him the north side first, where I knew the hardpan was shallow. He sank his long probe. It went in about 18 inches and stopped dead. He tried a few more spots. Same thing. There's your problem, he said. Shallow clay. Water's trapped. This was the diagnosis everyone had. I then led him over to the path the ducks had been working. Try it here, I said. He looked at the churned-up ground, then at the ducks, who had moved a little farther down the line but were still following the same invisible track. He set the tip of his probe in the mud and leaned on it. And then he went quiet. The probe sank. It didn't stop at 18 inches. It slid down through the earth with a soft, sucking sound. 2 feet, 3 feet, 4, 5. He had to readjust his hands, moving them lower on the rod. 6 feet, 7. The T-handle was nearly at the ground. The entire 8-foot rod was almost completely swallowed by the earth. He stood there for a moment, his hands resting on the handle, feeling what the steel was telling him. He didn't say a word. He pulled the rod out. It came up coated in a thick, dark, mottled slurry of soil and silt. He rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger. He walked 20 yards down the line and did it again. The probe sank just as easily. He spent the next half an hour in silence, walking the meandering path the ducks had laid out for him. He probed the ground every 20 or 30 feet. Every single time, the long steel rod sank deep into the earth. Then he would step 10 feet to the left or right of the path and try again. And every single time, the rod would hit the hardpan shelf at less than 2 feet. He was mapping the trench just as I had, but with a lifetime of practice sensitivity. He was feeling the difference between the dense, virgin clay and the soft, disturbed fill. He was reading the story of my grandfather's mistake in the language of pressure and resistance. When he was done, he walked the full length of the line back to me. He was wiping the mud from his probe with a rag from his back pocket. He didn't look at me, but back at the field, at the long, invisible scar the ducks had so perfectly revealed. He was quiet for so long I thought he was going to get in his truck and leave. But then he finally looked at me. He looked at the ducks. He looked back at the ground where his 8-foot probe had disappeared. He shook his head slowly, a look of grudging wonder on his face. Substantial, he said. The word was quiet, but it landed with the weight of a granite block. That's a substantial channel of fill. Never seen one that long that wasn't on a pipeline survey. I told him the story then. About my father's words, about the notebook, about the Marl Trench from 1938. He listened, nodding slowly. Never filled proper. He repeated my grandfather's words. That's it right there. He pushed wet clay back in with wet soil, made a dam out of mud. And these birds? He looked over at the ducks. They're breaking the seal. All that paddling year after year, it's like a million little spades. They're letting the water get a toehold again. He pointed toward the willows at the far end. The water wants to go there. Always did. You just had a beaver dam made of dirt in the way. And your ducks are chewing it out for you. He told me it might take another year, maybe two. But he was sure it would work. Keep the birds on it, he said as he was leaving. They're doing more good than a $60,000 tiling machine. That single word, substantial, from a man like George, was all the vindication I needed. It was an answer to my grandfather's question, delivered 70 years late by a man with a steel rod and a lifetime of paying attention. The real proof, the kind you can see and measure, came a month later. The first week of November brought a storm, a real gully washer. It rained 2.5 inches in less than 12 hours. In any other year, that would have been a catastrophe for the West 40. The field would have turned into a shallow, muddy lake, and the water would have sat there until the following June, stagnant and useless. I remember Frank Miller driving by slowly that morning, the rain hammering on the roof of his truck. He gave me a look that was part pity, part I told you so. He was already picturing the lake. I'll admit, a part of me was nervous. The theory was one thing. The reality of that much water was another. The next morning I was out at first light. The air was cold and clean. I walked to the edge of the West 40, my boots sinking into the wet grass. I braced myself for what I was going to see. But the lake wasn't there. The field was drenched. There was standing water, yes, sheets of it glistening in the early light. But it wasn't the dead, still water I was used to. It was moving. For the first time in my life, I could see a current. A slow, almost imperceptible but definite movement of water across the field. And it was all flowing toward one place. The long, meandering line that the ducks had worked all summer. That line had become a shallow, broad channel. The water was gathering there, finding the path of least resistance that the ducks and my grandfather's mistake had created. I walked the edge of the field, following the flow, all the way down to the willows that bordered the county ditch. And there, I saw something I had never seen before. A steady, clear stream of water was pouring out from under the fence line and into the ditch. It wasn't a trickle. It was a flow. The field was breathing. It was draining. The dam had been broken. The water had remembered the old way. Over the next week, the field transformed. The sheets of standing water shrank daily. The ground firmed up. By Thanksgiving, you could walk across the whole 40 acres without getting mud over the top of your boots. The ducks were still there, still working their line, but now they were paddling in mud instead of a pond. The following spring was the true test. I waited until late May, letting the ground dry and settle. Then I took a tractor out there. A real tractor with a disc. For the first time in over 70 years, the southern 20 acres of that field were dry enough to work. I disked it twice, turning over rich, black soil that hadn't seen the sun in decades. It was heavy, yes, but it was beautiful ground. I planted corn. I didn't push it. I put on a standard rate of fertilizer and planted a standard hybrid. I just wanted to see what it would do. That fall, I harvested it. The yield monitor in the combine cab climbed steadily as I went across the rows. When it was all done and the grain was in the bin, I did the math. The 20 acres I'd been able to plant averaged 182 bushels to the acre. It was some of the best corn on the whole farm. I had turned 40 acres of useless swamp, valued at maybe $500 an acre, into 20 acres of prime bottomland worth 10 times that. And the cost? The cost was a $50 load of free ducks and the patience to listen to a story told by a ghost. The numbers were the final word. The extension agent's $60,000 estimate for tiling was based on the assumption that the problem was uniform. But the problem wasn't the whole field. It was a 1,000-foot-long, 8-foot-deep strip of compacted fill. The solution wasn't to impose a new, expensive grid on the land, but to simply undo the old mistake. The ducks hadn't been a sentimental project. They had been the most efficient, targeted, and cost-effective piece of excavation equipment I could have possibly found. They were the answer to a question my grandfather had written down in 1938. The field was drained. The notebook was closed. A few weeks after I harvested that corn, Frank Miller's clean white truck pulled up to the fence line again. It was a Saturday morning, crisp and clear. I was out there with an auger, taking soil samples for the next year. He sat in his truck for a while, just looking out across the corn stubble. The field was dry. The stalks were shredded and the ground was clean. The northern half was still pasture, but it was firm, green pasture, not the usual collection of cattails and swamp grass. He rolled down his window.
I walked over.
"Morning, Frank," I said. "Morning, Tom," he replied. He kept looking at the field. He had seen the combine in there. He had seen the grain wagons coming out. He knew. You can't hide a corn harvest in a small town. "Got it planted this year," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Just the south half," I said. "Still a little damp on the north end," he nodded, chewing on that for a moment. He looked from the field to the ducks who were now foraging happily in the corn stubble, and then back to the field. He was connecting the dots. He was a man who believed in numbers, and the number of bushels I just pulled off that ground was impossible to ignore. Contradicted all his other data. He was wrestling with it. "Still holding some water up by the road," he said, pointing with his chin. He was right. There was a low spot there that was still spongy. He was holding on to a little piece of his certainty. I didn't argue. I just nodded. "Yep, it's not perfect." He looked at me. Then, and I saw something in his eyes that wasn't there before. Not exactly respect, but a kind of grudging acknowledgement. The look a man gives when the world has presented him with a fact that doesn't fit his understanding of it. He had watched me with those ugly birds all summer. He'd pitied me. He'd been certain I was a fool, a sentimental old man chasing a ghost. And now here was the corn stubble to prove him wrong. But he wouldn't say that. Men like Frank don't admit they were wrong. They just adjust their position slightly, without ever admitting it was moved. "But it ain't a lake no more," he said. That was it. That was the whole speech. That was his quiet concession. It was his way of saying, "You did it." He gave a single sharp nod, as if closing a ledger in his mind. Then he put the truck in gear and pulled away, leaving a small puff of dust hanging in the cold autumn air. I stood there and watched him go. There was no triumph in it. No feeling of being smarter or better. Just a quiet satisfaction. A rightness. The land was working again. The quiet conversation was over. The neighbor's small, understated acknowledgement was the period at the end of the sentence. My wife Sarah was right. My father would have liked those ducks. He would have understood that sometimes the oldest, slowest, and ugliest solution is the right one. He would have stood right where I was standing, looked out at the dry ground, and he wouldn't have said a thing. He would have just smiled. That was a better victory than any boastful word or "told you so." There's a lesson in that West 40, and it's one I think about a lot now. We live in a world that's in a hurry. A world of quick fixes and expensive certain answers. We have GPS that can map a field down to the square inch, and computer models that can predict yields before the seed is even in the ground. And those things are useful. I'm not saying they're not. But they only see what's there right now. They don't have a memory. They don't know about the marl trench dug in a hurry in 1938. They don't know about a farmer's circled question in a 50-cent notebook. The land has a long memory. It remembers every plow scar, every fence line, every crushed tile, every poorly filled ditch. And the water it remembers too. My father was right. It's always looking for the old paths. The ones that were there before we came along with our big machines and our grand plans. We get so busy imposing our will on the land that we forget to listen to what it's trying to tell us. We see a problem like a flooded field, and we immediately think we need to attack it with bigger equipment, more horsepower, more tile, more money. We try to force a solution, but sometimes the solution is quieter. Sometimes it's about taking something away, not adding something new. It's about finding the one small thing that's blocking the flow and just nudging it out of the way. In my case, that nudge came from 80 bald ducks that nobody wanted. They couldn't read a soil map. They didn't have a degree in hydrology. But they had an instinct that was older and truer than any of that. They had the patience to do a slow, methodical job for nothing more than a meal of grubs and a place to float. They paid attention. The difference between a problem and a lesson is only whether you were paying attention. We all have a West 40 in our lives. A piece of ground that everyone has written off. A problem that seems too big, too expensive, too permanent to solve. We get told by the experts that it's hopeless, that we should just accept it and move on. But maybe the experts are only looking at the surface. Maybe the answer isn't in a new machine, but in an old notebook. Maybe it's in a half-remembered piece of advice from someone long gone. Maybe the solution is already there, waiting. It might not be pretty. It might look like a flock of ugly birds. It might be slow. It will almost certainly require patience. But the truth is, the cleverest solutions are often the ones that have been there all along, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to be quiet enough to see them. The land, the animals, our ancestors, they're always talking to us. We just have to be willing to listen. If you've got your own flock of bald ducks, your own piece of flooded ground that holds a forgotten story, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. Let me know what you've learned from listening to the old ways. And if this story meant something to you, subscribe. There are more stories in this ground to tell.